The lantern flickered weakly against the wet Kentucky night, barely holding back the shadows that pressed against the cabin walls like something alive. Ruth had grown up in these woods, but lately they felt different, watchful, as though the trees themselves were leaning in to hear her thoughts. Her family said the woods kept them safe, that outsiders feared what they could not understand. But sometimes, when the wind pushed through the branches just right, she swore she heard whispering that didn't belong to the wind at all. She had been told since childhood that the world beyond the tree line was dangerous for a girl like her, that only her family knew what was best. But no one ever explained why they watched her so closely, why her footsteps were measured, why her future was spoken of like something already written, something she had no say in. And now, with her brother Elias returning after 10 years of silence, the air in the cabin had grown heavy, thick with expectations she didn't dare question aloud. He arrived just before dusk, walking up the dirt path barefoot, his clothes soaked as if he had come through the river instead of the road. The moment Ruth saw him, something cold slid down her spine. His eyes were familiar, yet distant, as though he had seen things the woods never meant any person to see. The family embraced him with a reverence that unsettled her, murmuring prayers of gratitude for the circle made whole again. That night, Ruth awoke to creaking floorboards and hushed voices drifting from the lower room, her name spoken like a promise, no, like a sentence. She pressed her ear to the wooden floor and heard her uncle say, "The time's come. The blood must stay true." The words slithered into her chest, tightening around her breath as she realized they weren't just talking about Elias's return. They were talking about her. The woods groaned outside the cabin, a long, low sound that reminded her of something waking up. She didn't know yet what her family expected of her, or why Elias looked at her with a strange mixture of sorrow and inevitability. But she felt the truth closing in from all sides. Something was terribly wrong here, something older than her family, older than the cabin, older even than the forest. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. Ruth had grown up with the phrase "keeping the blood pure" woven into the very fabric of her childhood, spoken so casually and so often that it blended into the background like the crackle of the cabin's old wood stove. No one ever sat her down to explain it. Instead, it drifted through her early years in murmured blessings, quiet warnings, and the strange, tense silences that followed whenever she asked too many questions. Her family treated the phrase as both a rule and a prayer, repeating it during meals, family gatherings, even during those eerie nights when storms rattled the windows and it seemed, just for a moment, that someone outside might be listening. For Ruth, it became a kind of puzzle, a fragment of meaning that never quite fit anywhere but was too important to ignore. As she grew older, she began noticing the moments when the phrase carried weight, like when her aunt gripped her wrist a little too firmly while brushing her hair and whispered it into her ear as though reminding herself of a duty. Or when her uncle paused mid-conversation with a trader from the nearest town, then shut the door with a finality that made Ruth's skin prickle. Outsiders weren't welcome, they said, because outsiders didn't understand their ways, their traditions, their history. But Ruth saw that it wasn't fear of being misunderstood that kept outsiders away, it was fear of something being discovered. There were stories she overheard by accident, fragments exchanged between adults who thought she was asleep. Stories about ancestors who had wandered too far from the family's path and vanished. Stories about children who were claimed by the woods because their blood had been mixed with something it shouldn't have been. Ruth didn't know if these tales were warnings or threats, but they clung to her mind, growing more disturbing with each passing year. And every time one of those whispered tales ended, someone would always repeat the phrase, slow and deliberate, like a reminder that forgetting it was dangerous. Ruth noticed early on that her family didn't treat her like other children in the backwoods. She wasn't allowed to play near the property line, wasn't allowed to speak to the rare travelers who passed through, and wasn't allowed to learn about the world outside the dense trees that circled their land. When she asked why, the adults answered with strained smiles and tight voices, insisting that everything she needed was already here, that wandering thoughts led to wandering feet, and wandering feet led to ruin. The phrase "keeping the blood pure" felt like an invisible fence placed around her childhood, something she couldn't touch but always felt pressing against her, shaping her, preparing her for a future she didn't yet understand. Elias's return was the kind of event that seemed to shift the air itself, as though the woods had been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled. Ruth barely remembered him. He had been sent away when she was very young, taken in the middle of the night without explanation. The adults whispered that he had gone to learn discipline, though their tightened jaws and worried glances suggested something far more unsettling. In the years that followed, his absence became a wound no one acknowledged, a subject tiptoed around with the same caution they used when speaking about storms or sickness. But when he reappeared on the dirt path leading to the cabin, the forest seemed to lean toward him, branches bending subtly as if recognizing something or someone it had been expecting. Ruth stood on the porch as he approached, her breath caught somewhere between curiosity and unease. He was taller now, his frame lean but tense, his eyes holding a depth that made her stomach tighten. He looked like someone who had spent too long in silence, too long in places without sunlight. His clothes clung to him in damp patches, and the mud on his feet looked older than the path he walked on. When her mother stepped forward to greet him, the embrace lacked warmth. It felt like a ritual, something rehearsed, something owed. Even the way her father placed a hand on Elias's shoulder seemed deliberate, a gesture meant less for affection and more for recognition of a role Ruth didn't yet understand. Inside the cabin, Elias barely spoke. Every movement he made felt measured, cautious, almost trained. When Ruth offered him a cup of water, he stared at it as though reacquainting himself with the concept of being cared for. Yet when their eyes met, she felt as if he were searching her face for answers to questions he wasn't allowed to ask aloud. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken, filled with the weight of all the years he had been gone and the mysteries surrounding his return. The family treated him with an odd combination of reverence and fear. They called him by his full name, something they never did with anyone else. They watched him the way one might watch a candle too close to a curtain, respectful of its necessity but wary of the damage it could cause. At night, Ruth overheard hushed conversations behind closed doors, her name mentioned alongside his in tones that made her skin crawl. She sensed that Elias wasn't simply returning home, he was returning to fulfill something. Something predetermined. Something that had been waiting for both of them. Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that Elias had not come back by choice. It felt as though someone or something had brought him home, as though the forest itself had sent for him, and now that he was here, nothing in the cabin would ever be the same again. The attic was always off limits, a shadowed space at the peak of the cabin that Ruth had been warned never to enter. Its door was small and heavy, bound with rusted hinges and a padlock that looked older than her earliest memories. Every time she passed it, she felt a shiver crawl up her spine, a mixture of curiosity and fear pressing against her chest. Her family never explained why the attic was forbidden, they only said it was for the good of the family and that some things were better left unseen. But the secrecy only made Ruth's fascination grow, and by the time she was 12, she found herself standing before the locked door more often than she would admit to anyone. The first time she tried to force it open, the padlock held firm, groaning under the strain but refusing to yield. She could hear faint whispers, or perhaps the wind echoing through the cracks of the old wood, and for a moment she hesitated, sensing that the attic held not just objects but memories, and perhaps even a living presence that didn't welcome intruders. Weeks later, armed with a small iron key she had found hidden behind a loose board in the hallway, she finally turned the lock. The click echoed through the cabin like a scream swallowed in velvet, and she realized instantly that this was a threshold she could not step back from. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the weight of decades, heavy enough to make her cough. Sunlight streamed in through a single, grimy window, illuminating stacks of crates, jars of dried herbs, and faded blankets folded with care. But it was the journals that drew her gaze first, leather-bound, brittle with age, stacked in neat piles along the far wall. The handwriting was meticulous, looping and deliberate, filled with dates, names, and cryptic notations about unions, promises, and blood kept true. As she flipped through them, her stomach churned. Generation after generation had recorded the same pattern: children arranged, families bound, lives predetermined by the same chilling creed her family had whispered to her all her life. The words made her head spin, a rhythm of inevitability she couldn't escape, each entry more detailed than the last, each revealing how deeply the practice had been embedded in their lineage. Among the journals, Ruth found sketches, too rough depictions of the forest, of hidden paths, of places where ceremonies had taken place. Some were simple, but others were grotesque, showing figures entwined in ways that made her blood run cold. The realization settled on her in waves. the life she had known, the quiet isolation, the constant warnings, were not just eccentricities or superstition, they were preparation, grooming her for a role she had never agreed to. And as she closed the last journal, she understood that the attic had been waiting for her curiosity to catch up with her, revealing the horrifying truth that the shadow over her childhood was far darker and far older than she had ever imagined. The first time Ruth heard the chanting, it was late, past the hour when even the crickets seemed to fall silent, and the moon hung low over the treetops, pale and swollen. She had been lying awake in her bed, pretending to sleep while listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin settling, when the sound reached her, a low, rhythmic murmur that made the floorboards beneath her tremble ever so slightly. At first, she thought it might be the wind, or perhaps a stray animal moving through the underbrush, but the cadence of the voices, the deliberate rise and fall, carried a precision that no natural sound could mimic. Her heart quickened, and curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, propelled her to the window. Outside, the woods seemed alive in a way she had never noticed before. Shadows shifted unnaturally, bending and stretching as though responding to the sound rather than the light. She followed the voices carefully, avoiding the path her parents had forbidden her to tread, until she reached a small clearing bathed in silver moonlight. There, she saw them, her family, circling a faintly glowing fire, their heads bowed, chanting in unison. Their voices rose and fell in a cadence both hypnotic and menacing, words she didn't fully recognize but felt lodged deep in her memory, as if she had been hearing them whispered all her life without understanding their meaning. And then she saw Elias. He stood in the circle, not at the edges like a stranger, but in the center, his gaze fixed on some unseen point, his hands moving in a rhythm that matched the chants. Ruth's stomach twisted. Something about the way he moved, the way the firelight reflected off his eyes, made him seem both present and absent, like a ghost tethered to the living. Her family's chanting called her name, intertwining it with Elias's, repeating it in a solemn, insistent mantra that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She realized that this was no ordinary ritual, no harmless tradition, they were calling them together, shaping them into something she didn't understand and had never consented to. Ruth's pulse raced as the wind shifted, carrying the sound of the chant deeper into the woods. She thought about running, but her legs felt heavy, as though rooted to the ground by some unseen force. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, listening, participating in the ceremony with a quiet hunger. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet a morbid fascination kept her frozen, forcing her to witness the solemn orchestration of her fate. The chanting was not just sound, it was a command, a binding, a warning, and as it washed over her, Ruth understood with chilling clarity that she and Elias were at the center of something ancient, dark, and unavoidable, and that the forest and the family that claimed it would not allow them to escape without exacting a price. The disappearance of the neighbor shook Ruth in a way that nothing else had. She had known Mr. Callahan for years, a quiet man who lived a mile down the dirt road, tending his small farm and greeting Ruth with a gentle nod whenever she passed. Unlike the rest of the adults around her, he didn't speak in hushed warnings or riddles about family legacy or keeping the blood pure. He was kind, even curious, asking questions that made her feel almost normal, almost like a child who could think beyond the cabin walls. But one morning, when she crept to the edge of her property to fetch water, she noticed that his fields were empty, his animals untended, and the smoke that usually rose from his chimney was absent. A deep unease settled in her chest before anyone else even noticed something was wrong. At first, the adults dismissed his absence with a few muttered words about travel or illness, but Ruth saw the flicker of something unspoken pass over her family's faces. Their eyes hardened, voices softened, and the corners of their mouths tightened as if swallowing secrets too bitter to speak. Over the next days, she caught snippets of conversation behind closed doors, words like interference, discovery, and consequences passing between them like a dangerous currency. The realization began to creep into her mind, subtle at first and then unmistakable. Mr. Callahan hadn't simply left. Something about the knowledge he might have gained, or the questions he dared to ask, had threatened the fragile order her family had maintained for generations. Ruth's curiosity battled with the fear that had been drilled into her since childhood. She remembered the warnings about outsiders, about prying eyes, about people who might see the truth behind the family's rituals. Now, she understood what those warnings had meant. Mr. Callahan had glimpsed the edges of their secret life, and the cost had been his disappearance. The woods seemed to close in more tightly after that, shadows stretching farther into the corners of her vision, and every creak of the cabin reminded her of the presence of unseen watchers. Even the animals in her yard seemed on edge, ears flicking toward empty spaces, as if they too sensed that something was terribly wrong. By the third night, Ruth began to connect the dots that no adult dared voice aloud. Her family's careful watch over her, the whispered warnings, the rituals in the woods, and Elias's return all pointed toward a pattern she was only beginning to comprehend. The neighbor's disappearance had been a warning, a silent statement of the lengths her family would go to preserve their hidden world. Ruth felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, a reminder that the forest, her family, and the customs she had been raised to obey were intertwined in ways that left no room for innocence or escape. Every thought she tried to hold on to, hope, rebellion, fear, was shadowed by the knowledge that the world outside the woods could not protect her, and the world within them could not be trusted. Elias's confession came one evening when the sun had dipped below the ridges of the Kentucky hills, leaving the cabin bathed in a gray, fading light. Ruth had been lingering near the fireplace, trying to make sense of the growing tension that had swallowed the household since his return. He appeared suddenly in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. For a long moment, he didn't speak, and Ruth found herself holding her breath, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would change everything she thought she knew. When he finally began, his voice was low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would awaken something that had been waiting for him. He told her about the underground room, a hidden chamber beneath the cabin where he had spent years of his childhood, kept away from the sun, from the world, from life as it was meant to be experienced. At first, Ruth couldn't comprehend it. How could a child survive in such a place? How could anyone live so long in darkness, with only the sound of their own heartbeat and the occasional footstep of a family member for company? Elias described the room in stark detail: the cold stone floor, the damp air that smelled of earth and decay, the chains of discipline disguised as protection, and the unyielding insistence that he was being prepared for a role he had no choice in accepting. He spoke of the lessons taught in whispers, of the rituals forced upon him in solitude, of the endless repetition of rules and commands that left no room for thought, no room for rebellion. He told her how he had been made to memorize the family's creed, to internalize the chilling phrases about keeping the blood pure, and how any hesitation, any spark of defiance, was met with punishment that went beyond pain, punishment that crushed hope and shaped the soul. Ruth listened, shivering as if the walls themselves had grown tighter around her, and she realized that the world she had thought she understood was only a thin veil covering a life meticulously orchestrated to enforce obedience and secrecy. Elias's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable, human in a way that no one in the family ever allowed him to appear. He confessed that the underground room had changed him, had shaped the way he walked, spoke, and even breathed. It had instilled in him a sense of inevitability, the feeling that certain things could never be avoided, that some paths were preordained and any attempt to stray would be met with consequences far worse than he had known as a child. Ruth felt a chill run through her chest as she understood the weight of his experience, not just for him, but for her. The truths he revealed were more than personal history. They were a warning, a map of the family's control and the machinery of tradition that bound them both. And as he fell silent, she realized that his confession was not just about the past, it was a prelude to the choices that would soon be demanded of them both, a grim revelation of how deeply they had already been ensnared. Ruth had never trusted her own reflection in the creek, not entirely. The water usually shimmered like liquid glass, showing the familiar curve of her cheek, the slope of her nose, the hair that tumbled like dark silk down her back. But one late afternoon, when the sun hung low and the shadows of the trees stretched long over the forest floor, the reflection that greeted her was not her own. She leaned closer, the cool water lapping at her fingers, and froze. The face staring back was hers, yet older, more worn, with eyes that carried a knowledge she had not yet earned and a sorrow she could not name. The lips were pressed in a tight, weary line, and for a moment, Ruth thought she might be seeing a ghost, an echo of herself from some impossible future. She blinked, and the image shifted with the water's movement, as if acknowledging her presence, as if trying to communicate something urgent that words could never capture. Panic rose in her chest, and she pulled back, but the reflection followed her, rippling over the surface, refusing to vanish. Ruth's mind raced. Was it a trick of the light, a hallucination born from too many nights spent awake, listening to her family's whispered rituals? Or was it something far older, something tied to the blood that ran through her veins and the forest that circled the cabin like a living wall? The sense of being watched, which had haunted her since childhood, intensified, settling into a heavy, oppressive weight that made her knees weak. As she stared, the older version of herself seemed to move independently of Ruth's own reflection, tilting its head slightly, as though urging her to see, to understand. Her pulse pounded in her ears, echoing the unspoken warnings her parents had always given, that some truths were too heavy for ordinary eyes, that some knowledge carried a price. And yet, Ruth felt compelled to stay, to confront what she was seeing, as if the reflection were a fragment of a secret she had been destined to uncover. She traced the water's surface with trembling fingers, and the image wavered but did not disappear, leaving her with the chilling sense that she was staring not just into the creek but into the inevitability of her own path. A sudden rustle behind her snapped Ruth's attention to the forest. Shadows moved among the trees, though no one appeared. When she turned back to the creek, the older version of herself was gone, leaving only her own pale, frightened face staring back. But the feeling lingered, an echo, a warning, a premonition that the life she had known was fragile, that forces beyond her comprehension were already shaping her future. Ruth could not shake the certainty that the reflection had been real, that it had meant to show her something she could not yet understand, and that in the days to come, the line between herself and that mysterious figure in the water would blur in ways both terrifying and unavoidable. The family council was called on a night so still that even the wind seemed to have retreated into the far corners of the forest. Ruth had been told to stay in her room, to avoid the gathering downstairs, but the way her name had been whispered earlier, with an urgency that made her heart pound, drew her like a moth to a flame. She crept along the hallway, careful to keep her footsteps light, until she reached the doorway of the cellar. The scent of wax and earth drifted up, mingling with a faint, metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Candles flickered in the dim space, casting long, trembling shadows along the stone walls, and the faces of her relatives appeared more severe, more deliberate than she had ever seen. At the center of the room, Elias stood as though he belonged there, a quiet yet undeniable authority surrounding him. Ruth's pulse quickened, she felt a cold knot form in her chest as she watched her family settle into their ritualized positions, a circle that seemed to enclose not just them but her, the very air itself, as if the room had been built to trap more than bodies. Her parents' eyes met hers for the briefest of moments, flickering with a mixture of expectation and warning, before returning to the solemn business of the council. The murmurs began, low at first, swelling into a rhythm that resonated with the beating of her own heart. Words were chosen carefully, the language deliberate, heavy with generations of tradition, confirming alliances and duties, sealing promises that could never be broken. When the elders spoke of the binding ceremony, Ruth felt as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. Her throat tightened, and a cold sweat prickled her skin. The ceremony was not a mere custom or symbolic gesture, it was a designation, an assignment, a declaration that she and Elias were to be joined in the way her family had always intended, a continuation of a legacy that neither of them had chosen. Each word carried weight, echoing off the stone walls, embedding itself into her mind. The repetition of her name alongside Elias's felt like chains coiling invisibly around her limbs, tightening with every syllable, with every glance from a relative who nodded solemnly as if confirming a fate long preordained. Ruth's vision blurred slightly as she took in the room, the flickering candlelight, the stern faces, the deliberate cadence of tradition binding the present to the past. She realized then that this council was not merely a family meeting. It was an assertion of control, a ritual of power, a declaration that the woods themselves were complicit in enforcing the rules her family had followed for generations. And as the council concluded, with hands joined and eyes lowered, Ruth understood that there was no choice here, no space to defy, no moment to hesitate. The family had spoken, and in their words, the weight of generations pressed down on her and Elias, leaving them caught in a web from which neither the cabin, the woods, nor the blood that ran through them could offer escape. Ruth discovered the forbidden trail by accident, or perhaps by the quiet insistence of her own restless curiosity. It began as a faint disturbance in the undergrowth, a narrow path partially hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves that seemed to wind deeper into the forest than she had ever dared to wander. She remembered the countless warnings her family had murmured over the years, tales of outsiders who wandered too far, of children who strayed and were never seen again, but something in the way the path beckoned felt inevitable, as though it had been waiting for her. Her feet moved before her mind could fully protest, and with each careful step, the canopy above thickened, filtering the sunlight into green-gold shadows that danced like specters around her. As she walked, Ruth's senses sharpened. The forest was alive with subtle signals, broken twigs that suggested hurried passage, faint footprints pressed into the damp earth, and a distant, hollow sound that might have been water or might have been something breathing. The further she went, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, carrying a weight that pressed on her chest. After what felt like hours, she came upon an abandoned shack, half collapsed, its wood grey and slick with years of rain. It smelled of mold, decay, and something more subtle, something that hinted at desperation and despair. She paused at the doorway, feeling a chill that wasn't entirely caused by the wind, a sense that she was stepping into a space where time itself had been held hostage by secrets too dark to name. Inside, the shack told its story with silence and shadow. The floorboards creaked under her weight, revealing faint stains, discarded scraps of cloth, and remnants of a life abruptly abandoned. The walls were etched with primitive marks, tallying days or events she could not decipher, but the message was clear: someone had suffered here, someone had tried to resist the forces that bound them, and they had paid for it. Ruth's breath caught as she realized that this was no ordinary shelter. It had been a place of punishment, a hidden record of rebellion against her family's rules, and the echoes of that rebellion lingered, whispering warnings she could not ignore. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, yet something compelled her to press on, to understand what had happened here. She traced the marks along the walls, imagining the fear, the defiance, the courage it had taken to enter this space in the first place. And in that moment, Ruth understood that the trail was more than a path through the forest. It was a map of consequence, a guide to the price of resistance, a harrowing lesson in the power her family wielded. The shack, the path, the dense trees surrounding her, they were all a reminder that escape was never simple, that freedom came with danger, and that the shadow of her ancestors' choices stretched long and unyielding into her own life, threatening to ensnare her just as it had trapped those who had walked before. The night of the ceremony arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to seep into Ruth's very bones, making her shiver despite the heavy wool dress she wore. The forest around the cabin was unnaturally quiet, as if every creature had gone into hiding, and the moon cast a pale, sickly light through the branches, painting the clearing in silver and shadow. Ruth could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, the centuries of family tradition wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and even the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The adults moved with a solemn precision, carrying candles and tools of ritual that she didn't recognize, their faces masks of reverence and fear. Elias stood near her side, silent, his hand brushing hers only briefly, a touch that carried both reassurance and inevitability. As the ceremony began, the chanting started low, a guttural sound that rolled across the clearing, vibrating in Ruth's chest and making her knees weak. The circle of her family tightened, enclosing her and Elias at its center, their voices layering over one another in a rhythm that felt older than memory, older than the forest itself. Ruth's eyes scanned the assembly, seeing faces she had known all her life distorted by candlelight into expressions of fanatic devotion, each of them bound by rules they would never question. And then she realized that the ritual was more than a performance, more than a statement of allegiance. It was a binding of the forest to the family, a tethering of the land itself to their bloodline, making the woods a living participant in the ceremony. Fear rose in her throat as she understood the stakes. The trees, the soil, even the wind seemed to lean in toward the circle, as if aware that the moment had arrived, that the pact written in the journals, sung in the chants, and etched into the lineage of her ancestors would be sealed tonight. Every instinct in Ruth screamed to flee, to break the chain before it tightened around her forever, but the weight of the centuries pressing down on her made movement nearly impossible. Elias's eyes met hers, and in that gaze she saw the reflection of the same dread she felt, the same realization that their lives were not entirely their own, that leaving would not be simple and that the forest itself would resist any attempt to escape. The ritual progressed, each gesture precise, each word pronounced with care, binding their fates more tightly with every passing moment. Ruth could feel the pulse of something ancient, a presence that watched and judged, demanding obedience. She understood then that the ceremony was not simply a family tradition but a mechanism of control, one that had shaped generations and would not allow them to leave without consequence. The forest had been waiting, the family had been waiting, and now it all converged upon her. She recognized with a growing horror that this night was not just about her, not just about Elias, but about the culmination of decades, centuries, of secret devotion to a pact that transcended human will, and that to defy it would require confronting forces that had been shaping her life long before she could even comprehend them.